I've investigated some strange cases in my life, but this one still bothers me because the man sitting across from me claimed something that should have been impossible. He said he hadn't slept in 20 years, not badly slept, not slept very little. He said he hadn't slept at all for 20 years, no naps, no nights of sleep, nothing. At first I thought he was joking. Then I looked at his face. He wasn't smiling. He looked exhausted, but not the way you'd expect someone who hadn't slept in 20 years to look. That's what made me curious. His name was Elias. He was 51. He worked at a hardware store on the edge of town, the kind of man nobody looks at twice. Same gray jacket every day, black coffee, never late. The people he worked with had no idea. To them, he was just quiet. But he kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket. I asked him what was in it. He handed it to me without a word. Every page was the same, a date and a number. The number of nights he believed he had gone without sleep. The last page said 7,304. He had counted every single one. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a story he was telling me. It was a life he was living. 20 years is a long time to carry one story about yourself, long enough that it stops being a problem and starts being who you are. Elias didn't just believe he never slept. He had become the man who never sleeps. It was the first thing he told a stranger, the reason he gave for everything, why he was tired, why he was slow, why he was alone. Take the sleeplessness away, and you don't just fix a man. You erase the only explanation he ever had for his own life. I didn't understand that yet, but I would. I leaned forward and asked him one simple question. When was the last time you remember sleeping? He stared at me for a moment, then he said, I don't remember. I thought he meant it had been a long time, so I asked again. When was the last time you actually slept? He shook his head. No, you don't understand. I don't sleep. I wrote one word in my notebook, impossible. But I've learned something during my investigations. When a case sounds impossible, that's usually when you should start looking closer. My first theory was the boring one. I thought he was lying, not to me, to himself. People exaggerate. I didn't sleep a wink usually means I slept badly. So I walked in ready to catch a man stretching the truth. That theory died in the first 10 minutes because Elias didn't want attention. He didn't want to be special. He wanted it to stop. You can fake a symptom. It's much harder to fake wanting it gone. So I put my easy answer away, and I started treating him like a case instead of a liar. So I asked him to tell me about his nights. He said he went to bed like everyone else. He closed his eyes. He stayed in bed. But according to him, he never actually fell asleep. Every night he remained conscious until morning. That raised my first question. If he never slept, how was he still functioning? He worked every day. He exercised. He talked to people. He drove. He lived a completely normal life. Or at least, that's what he told me. His daughter was the one who found me. Her name was Nora. She told me she hadn't really slept in years either, not because of her own nights, because of his. She used to wake at strange hours and find him sitting on the edge of the bed, in the dark, perfectly still, staring at nothing. She would say his name. He never answered, and in the morning, he remembered none of it. She wasn't afraid he was lying. She was afraid he was disappearing. She had tried everything a daughter tries. She moved back in for a while. She sat up with him. She begged him to see one more doctor. Nothing reached him, because in his mind, there was nothing to reach. You can't cure a man of a night he swears he spent awake. That was why she wanted someone to watch. I needed evidence, and fortunately, there was plenty of it. His family had installed cameras inside his bedroom because they were worried about him. So I watched the footage. The first few hours were completely normal. At 11 p.m., he went to bed. Midnight, still awake. 1 a.m., still awake. 2 a.m., still awake. Then the clock reached 3:17 a.m., and that's when I noticed something strange. He suddenly sat upright. He stared straight ahead and stopped moving. I paused the video. I rewound it. Then I watched it again. Nothing. No obvious movement, no reaction. He simply sat there for several seconds. Then he started moving again. I checked the timestamp, 3:17 a.m. I made a note of it. Then I watched the next night, and the same thing happened. 3:17 a.m. He sat up, stopped moving, and stared into the darkness. That couldn't be a coincidence. So I watched another night. same thing. 3:17, again and again. Now I had a question. Why did this happen at exactly the same time every night? I slowed the footage down. That's when I noticed something I had missed before. His breathing changed. It became slower. His body relaxed. His eyes were open. But something about him looked completely different. I watched him carefully, and then it hit me. What if he wasn't awake? What if he was sleeping, with his eyes open? That was my first real lead, but before I trusted my own eyes, I had to rule out everyone else's. Because I wasn't the first person to look at Elias. Over 20 years, he had seen doctor after doctor, neurologists, sleep clinics, 2 overnight studies, wired to machines that measured everything, and every report said the same thing. He slept, not much, but he slept. He had read those reports himself. He kept them in a folder thicker than my case file. And every single time, he decided the machines were wrong because he remembered the nights. He remembered lying awake. And a memory feels louder than a printout. So the doctors gave up, and he went on counting. I started researching everything I could find about unusual sleep behavior, and that's when I came across something called microsleep. Microsleep is exactly what it sounds like. Very brief episodes of sleep that can happen when your brain is extremely tired. Sometimes they last only a few seconds. And here's the strange part, you may not even realize they happened. That sounded promising, but it didn't explain the case. A few seconds of microsleep couldn't explain 20 years without sleep. So I went back to the footage, and I started looking at something different. Not his eyes, not his body, his memory. Because there was something about his story that didn't make sense. He wasn't saying, I know I don't sleep. He was saying, I don't remember sleeping. Those are 2 very different things. So I decided to test it. I spent an entire night watching him. At 11 p.m., he went to bed. At midnight, nothing unusual happened. Then, at 1:13 a.m., his eyes closed. I checked the clock. He stayed completely still for several seconds. Then, his eyes opened. I asked him, did you just fall asleep? He looked at me like I had asked the strangest question in the world. No, I was awake. I didn't argue. I just wrote down the time. 1:13 a.m. Then, at 2:07 a.m., it happened again. Eyes closed, body relaxed, slow breathing. Then he opened his eyes. I asked him again, did you sleep? He shook his head. No. But this time, I knew something was wrong, because I had been watching him, and I had seen what he couldn't remember. Then came 3:17 a.m. The exact same thing happened. He sat up, his eyes were open, he stared into the darkness, and for several seconds, he didn't respond to anything around him. I looked at the clock, then I looked at him, and suddenly the entire case changed. I had been trying to prove whether this man slept, but that wasn't the mystery anymore. The mystery was much stranger. Why didn't he know that he was sleeping? I started digging deeper, and I discovered something called sleep state misperception. It's a phenomenon in which a person can perceive themselves as being awake for much longer than they actually were. In other words, you can sleep and genuinely believe you didn't. Your brain can enter sleep, your body can rest, but when you wake up, your memory may tell you something completely different. I was awake all night. It feels real. You remember lying there. You remember thinking. You remember watching the clock. But you may not remember the moments when you were actually asleep, and suddenly, the man's story made sense. He wasn't lying to me. He wasn't trying to fool his family. He genuinely believed he hadn't slept in 20 years. The problem wasn't his honesty. The problem was his perception. His brain had been hiding the evidence from him. I did the hardest part of the case in his kitchen the next morning. I told him. I told Elias he had been sleeping for 20 years. Not well, not enough, but sleeping. I expected relief. I got silence. He looked down at the notebook in his hand. 7,304 nights, a number he had built his whole life around. And I watched him realize it might not be true. For a man who never slept, you've been sleeping is not good news. It's losing the one thing he was sure of. Nora reached over and took his hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't let go of the notebook either. Then he asked me one question. If I've been sleeping, he said, then where did all those nights go? And I realized I didn't have an answer for that. Not one that would give them back to him. I thought the case was over, until I watched the 3:17 a.m. recording one more time. Something had bothered me about it. I turned up the volume. At first, I heard nothing. Then, I heard breathing. Slow, deep, steady. I watched the man on the screen. His eyes were open. He was sitting upright. He looked completely awake. But the sound told me something else. He was asleep. And that's when I realized something even more disturbing. The strangest part of this case wasn't that a man believed he had never slept. It was that his own brain had convinced him he was awake, while he was doing exactly the opposite. I closed my notebook. Case solved. At least, that's what I thought, because before I left, I looked at the clock one last time. 3:17 a.m., exactly the same time. And for the first time that night, I wondered if I was really watching him, or if he was watching me.